hear me now? How about the back row? Great. Dr. Michael Renner, who was scheduled to act as moderator tonight, was called out of town due to a death in his family, and he sends his regrets for being the moderator tonight. So it's my privilege to introduce tonight's three distinguished scientists who are here to share their brand new book, Animal Tool Behavior. I would like to remind you to jot down any questions on the form that's inside of your program. At the end of the program, we will have a brief question and answer period, and we can have our distinguished guests answer the questions for you. And I would also like to remind you that we do have a person here from the bookstore, John, and he's here to sell copies of his book. And one of the things that I'm very strong about is please buy local. Please buy a book from one of our local businesses here in town. Now, in the academic tradition, I'm going to read the introduction and a little bit about each of our distinguished guests. So, the first published in 1980, Dr. Benjamin B. Beck's original Animal Tool Behavior was the first volume of its kind to catalog and analyze complete literature on tool use and manufacture in non-human animals. His work inspired and energized legions of researchers to study the use of tools by a wide variety of species. The revised book that you will hear about tonight is the direct result of the work by three generations of scientists. Dr. Benjamin Beck, and would you stand briefly, please? Known by many, is a comparative psychologist specializing in animal cognition and biodiversity conservation. During his distinguished career, he maintained an avid interest in the welfare of animals while researching the adaptation to the wild by reintroduced captive-born animals. Between 1983 and 2005, he coordinated the preparation, reintroduction, and post-release monitoring of 150 golden lion tamarins in Brazil that reintroduced the population, which has now grown to 550, about 1/3 of the entire wild population. In his current position as Director of Conservation for the Great Ape Trust, Dr. Beck is coordinating an initiative in Rwanda to establish a national conservation park in the Gishwati forest and conserve a small chimpanzee population living there. In fewer than 3 years, the protected area of the Gishwati has increased from 2,190 acres to 3,665 acres, and the chimpanzee population has grown from 13 to 19, probably the first time the population has grown in more than 40 years. The Rwandan government has approved Beck's plan to connect the small Gishwati forest with the Nyungwe National Park, 50 kilometers to the south, by means of a forest corridor. His team is currently developing an innovative and socially just way to acquire the land for the corridor. Dr. Beck studied at the Union College in New York, received his MA from Boston University, and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He was research curator and curator of primates at the Brookfield Zoo from 1970 to 1982, where he was a principal in the design of the construction of Tropic World, one of the first large-scale mixed-species tropical forest exhibits. He served at the Smithsonian Institution's National Zoological Park as general curator and associate director from 1983 until his retirement in 2003. He designed the National Zoo's innovative free-ranging golden lion tamarin exhibit and was the project executive for Think Tank, a pioneering exhibit on animal thinking that opened in 1995. He was on the negotiating team that brought giant pandas from China to the zoo in 2000. Dr. Beck was appointed Scientist Emeritus at the Smithsonian Conservation Biological Institute in 2010. Our next distinguished speaker for me to introduce is Dr. Rob Shoemaker. Dr. Shoemaker, who many in the audience will remember from his work as director of the Orangutan Research and the Great Ape Trust, currently serves as Vice President of Life Sciences at the Indianapolis Zoo. There he leads the zoo's curatorial team in all aspects of the management and care of the zoo's animal and plant collection. Dr. Shoemaker has over 25 years of diverse experience working with accredited institutions, including 20 years at the Smithsonian Institute's National Zoo. Dr. Shoemaker is the author of 2 books, Primates in Question and Orangutans. Along with being widely published, Dr. Shoemaker has also appeared on dozens of documentaries and programs airing on National Geographic, Animal Planet, my favorite, the Discovery Channel, and BBC and PBS. He is widely consulted on animal welfare issues, particularly those involving primates, and has been invited to lecture on these topics around the world. Dr. Shoemaker received his Bachelor of Science degree, Master of Science degree, and PhD from the George Mason University. He's an affiliate professor at the Iowa State University and external research associate at the Krasnow Institute at the George Mason University. And our third distinguished author tonight is Dr. Christina Walkup. Dr. Walkup first began working with the Great Ape Trust as a volunteer, and by 2004 was conducting research with the orangutans, which helped her develop solid relationships with the individual animals. Dr. Walkup was the first doctoral candidate to conduct dissertation research on the Great Ape Trust. Her research as student of Dr. Shoemaker revealed that the red ape's sophisticated understanding of the cause and effect of using tools, very important. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in biology from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, and her Master of Arts degree in anthropology from the Iowa State University. She holds a PhD from the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology program and the Development of Anthropology at the Iowa State University. She has submitted several manuscripts for publication from her dissertation. Dr. Walkup currently serves as biology instructor at the Des Moines Area Community College. And now, it's my great pleasure to welcome our first guest up to the podium.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jan Kaiser, who's somewhere in the room, who organized all of this. And thanks to the sponsors and also to the audience for turning out tonight. Well, I'm really fired up about this book. When I did the first edition in 1980, we had 600 references. And I thought it covered just about every published reference about tool use at the time. And for this edition, we have more than 1,700 references, which indicates the growth of the field. I would like to believe it's because of the first edition, but I don't think that's the case at all. Another reason I'm really excited about this book is that, as Greg alluded, there's 3 generations of scholars. Rob was my student, and Christina was Rob's student. So there are 3 generations of us that have collaborated on this book, and I can tell you that I don't think any one of us could have done this alone. Whoop. So people say to me, where do you start when you do a book like this? Well, the place I started was definition. What is a tool? Now, if I ask you that question, I think most of you would say, well, I know what a tool is. So we're going to play a little exercise, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you think the examples I'm about to give you is tool use. You will not be held accountable. There are no grades, but it is fun to get involved in some of the complexities of definition. So how about primates, in this case chimpanzees, macaques, and capuchin monkeys, pounding fruits, nuts, and snails with stones? Tool use? Not tool use. Anybody who thinks it's not tool use? Okay, 100%. How about a seagull that drops a snail onto a parking lot in order to open it? Is the parking lot a tool? Raise your hand. Oh, not so much unanimity on that one. Okay, now we got a sea otter who also pounds the clam on a stone but holds the stone on its chest. Tool use or not tool use? All right. So it's still not 100%. People are kind of thinking about this. We think that a tool has to be held or manipulated during use. That there's something about a tool that says it has to be held or manipulated during use. But if that's the case, then a bird's nest is not a tool. Does anybody here believe a bird's nest is a tool to raise young? Well, good. You're all in agreement. That's wonderful. So is a stack of boxes a tool? And if so, how does that differ from a bird's nest? Now you're starting to get irritated, right? This is hard. How How about a baboon reaching for food with a stick? Tool use, no problem. How about an elephant reaching for food with his trunk? No, okay. A chimpanzee using a grass stalk to extract ants and termites from nests? First, unanimous. How about an anteater using its wonderful tongue? No. Ellen's sitting down there shaking her head, no. So, body parts are not probably, at least the parts of the user's body are not allowable, right, as a tool. Now, we're not against using body parts. Here is a wild macaque in Thailand. Comes from a group of macaques that lives in a temple, and what they've learned to do is come down and pluck hairs out of people's heads, the poor unfortunate on the left, and use them as dental floss. These animals were not trained in any way. Tool use? Okay. Here's a picture of a raven pulling in a string to which food has already been attached. Is the string a tool? Come on, get your hands up if you think it's a tool. No, what's the problem? Why not 100%? By the way, the raven's very cool. You know, it's a long string, and he picks the string up and steps on it. Then he picks the string up a little more and steps on it until the food's within reach. But there's something about, if we go back to the raven, there's something about the need for the tool user to establish the critical connection between the tool and the object, right? Okay, if that's the case, is that little female climbing out of the primate center on a stick that's been positioned by another chimpanzee using that stick as a tool? Well, that little female didn't reposition it, didn't establish the critical connection. She just scooted up it. There has to be a purpose to tool use, we think. And this is a wonderful example of object play. Porpoises in several aquaria now have been seen to blow these wonderful bubble rings out of their blowholes, but it seems to have absolutely no purpose whatsoever. So it's probably just object play, not tool use at all. So to be a tool, we think the object has to be a manipulable environmental object, not part of the user's body. It's got to be held or manipulated in its entirety. It has to have a purpose. It's got to alter the form or position or condition of another object or another animal. And the user has to make that critical connection. This is a consensus definition. There are always borderline cases. Take-home lesson about science. We try to be absolutely absolutely solid in our definitions, but sometimes it is really difficult to decide what to include and not include. Tool making is a little bit easier. It's a structural modification of an object, so it serves better as a tool. The orangutan on the left has two choices. In order to get food out of that pipe that's between its feet, it needs a stick without any projections on it. So it can either break off a single branch, or it could take the base of the tree and subtract a stick and use the base of the tree. And apes also make tools by combining objects, and as you'll see a little later, they make tools also by fundamentally reshaping objects. So that's the definition game. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Christina now. Go right ahead. Well, I go this way.
Thank you, Ben. Well, one of the things we discuss in the book, we actually conclude the book with a chapter on myths regarding tool behavior. And one of the myths that we tackle is this idea that only primates use and make tools. You may have guessed from the title of our book, Animal Tool Behavior, that we don't think that's true. But many of you, if you've seen tool behavior, you may have seen this picture of this chimpanzee using a tool to extract termites from a nest. And this is one of the most popular images. Oh, okay. Is that better? Okay. This is one of the most popular images of tool behavior. So I'd like to give you some examples of the diversity of tool behavior in the animal kingdom to tackle this particular myth. So actually, starting off with the invertebrates, there's a lot of really interesting cases of tool use in different types of insects. For example, this is a type of larvae of a species of beetle. And if you look at the picture here, you can see that the beetle is actually carrying on it a layer of debris. And some call this a fecal shield or a trash packet. It's basically materials that may deter a predator from eating it. And so by carrying this around, it deters, it helps to protect itself. It also helps often to camouflage the larvae. And this is actually an interesting example. We know that, of course, humans use camouflage quite often, but when we go throughout the animal kingdom, there's very few examples of camouflage outside of humans and insects. And so this is something we kind of share with insects that we don't actually share with the primates. Hermit crabs are tool users. If any of you have ever had a hermit crab as a pet, I don't know if you've ever thought of them as tool users, but that shell that they carry around, they don't actually make that shell. They carry around the empty shell of a snail, and they actually live in that, and that protects them. And so the shell in this case is the tool that the hermit crab depends on for its survival. Another species that depends on shells for its protection is this particular species of octopus, the veined octopus. And it carries around a different type of shell, though. It finds coconut shells that humans have sliced open and tossed into the ocean. And so it finds these coconut shells in the bottom of the ocean, and it actually stacks them up, and it carries them around with it until it's threatened. And when it's threatened, it puts them back together and hides inside. We know that there are some fish that use tools. It's actually kind of rare for fish to be using tools, but there are a few examples, and this is one of the best examples. This is the archer fish. The archer fish actually takes water into its mouth, and it spits it at insects that are sitting on a leaf or a piece of vegetation above the surface of the water, and so it shoots the water at the insects. And so what's the tool in this case? Yep, the water is the tool in this situation. There's numerous great examples with the birds. So birds are certainly well known for tool use. In particular, the ravens and the crows are exceptional tool users. New Caledonian crows have been in the news quite a bit for their many examples of tool use. And this picture of this crow, they actually cut out that tool from that vegetation. So they use their beak to snip out the shape of the tool, and they use that to extract insects from underneath of the tree bark or inside of a hollow of a tree. The New Caledonian crows also make what are called hook tools, and so they actually will snip apart the vegetation so that their tool actually has a hook on the end of it. And aside from humans, these are the only other animals that make hook-shaped tools, so they can latch onto the insects with that particular hook. In the birds, we see many cases of tool use that aren't just related to extracting insects, though. We see interesting cases such as bait fishing. Birds like the green heron, they'll actually take a piece of bait and they'll hold it in their beak, and they'll drop that bait on the surface of the water. They'll wait for the fish to come nibbling at that bait, and as soon as the fish are within range, they'll snatch up the fish. So the bait is the example of the tool here. So some of you are probably thinking, have you seen tool use in your own life? Have you observed your own animals around you using tools? And maybe you're thinking of dogs. Okay, does your dog use a tool? Anyone have a dog that's used a tool? There's some examples. We found a really interesting example in the book. This is a spaniel, and she tends to get a little possessive with her toys. What she does is she'll take her hockey puck and she'll put it in her frisbee, and then she'll carry around the Frisbee. So the Frisbee is the container, so she can possess both toys. So it allows her to keep the toys away from other dogs and from other people. We certainly know that dolphins are intelligent animals, so it probably won't surprise you to learn that dolphins also use tools. This example here, the dolphin actually carries around a sponge in its rostrum, and as it digs around on the ocean floor for fish, this helps to protect it as it's digging. Elephants are also known for being quite sophisticated in terms of their intelligence, and this is an example of an elephant that's using a fly swatter. So it's actually detached that branchy twig or branchy fly swatter from the one laying next to its feet there, and it uses that to keep the flies away from it. So by this time, it should be pretty clear to you that this is certainly a myth. Only primates use and make tools. That's just simply not true. There's many examples of tool use outside of primates, but what is true is that the most sophisticated and the most diverse examples of tool use are found within the primates. To give you a few examples, I'd like to give you a few examples in the monkeys, and then Dr. Shoemaker will talk to you more about examples in the apes. So monkeys are primates, just like humans and the great apes. And this is one of the examples that Dr. Beck mentioned with the flossing macaque. We actually see the most diversity in the primates, though, in the capuchin monkeys. These are actually a small monkey that's native to South America, and they use tools in a variety of ways. In the picture, you can see the monkey using a stone to actually crack open a nut. And this is similar somewhat to what we see in chimpanzees. They also use tools for digging. So they're, in this case, the monkey's digging for tubers that are underground. And they'll also use sticks to try to extract insects from tree hollows. And the capuchin monkeys bring me up to the next myth that I wanted to mention. There's been this assumption that tool behavior is equated with intelligence. That whenever we see tool behavior, that means that we're seeing an intelligence. And so what we have here in this photograph, we have an experiment that's conducted in captivity with the capuchin monkeys. And the experiment is called the trap tube task, and it's set up to probe what do they really understand about the tool? Are they really able to use it with flexibility and understanding of how the tool actually works? So in the task, the monkey has to use the tool and has to push that circular food reward that you see there, push it out of the tube. And if you look at the picture, there's actually a trap. So if the monkey pushes that food into the trap, they don't get the reward. Okay, so the trick is always to push the food out and away from the trap. So in this case, you can see the monkey's going to lose the food, okay, because she's going to push it into that trap if she keeps on her current course. If you look at this setup, though, you can see that the way the monkey's pushing that tool, she's pushing the food so it's going to come out of that tube and away from the trap. So in this case, she's going to get the food reward. And you would think that if the monkeys were able to solve the problem, showing that they could consider the properties and the complexity of the problem, that they would learn to solve this pretty quickly, that they would learn to get that food reward pretty quickly. But in fact, monkeys rarely solve this above chance levels. 50% of the time they get the food reward, the other 50% of the time they lose it. And so it demonstrates to us that they don't really have a sophisticated understanding of how to use this tool. Whereas when apes are presented with this task, and it's kind of hard to make out where the food reward is in this case, in this picture, but when they're presented with with the same task, they can learn to solve this type of problem at a much faster rate than the capuchin monkeys. So furthermore, if you think back to some of those other examples that I mentioned earlier, when we see fish, for example, using tools should we assume that those fish are using it with intelligence? Are they using a tool with flexibility and understanding of the properties of the tool? And actually, researchers have conducted experiments with the archer fish here, and they've learned that the fish can actually, from the very first time that it performs this behavior, it can perform this correctly. So it doesn't need any practice, it doesn't need to learn from others, it does this right away. And so it indicates that there's a genetic component here guiding the tool behavior in this case. And moreover, there's actually a lot of non-tool behaviors that we associate with intelligence. For example, gorillas, they're actually not really well known for using tools in the wild. There's a few examples, but gorillas really don't exhibit the same amount of tool behavior in terms of frequency that we see in the other types of apes. But there's no question that gorillas are intelligent and that they can keep track of social relationships in the wild, that they can navigate a very complex environment, they can use complex processing of their food, and in captivity they can actually use American Sign Language to communicate. So there's no question that they're intelligent, but they don't exhibit a lot of tool behaviors. So just to summarize this, this is certainly a myth that tool behavior is always equated with intelligence, because not all tool behavior is cognitively sophisticated. We see many non-tool behaviors that are cognitively sophisticated, such as those examples with the gorilla. And so we simply can't equate tool behavior with intelligence. However, the most complex forms of tool behaviors are found, as you would probably expect, in the most intelligent animals, and namely in the great apes. And I'm going to let Dr. Shoemaker talk about that.
So there's a story that we like to tell. Ben first reported this story in the 1980 version of Animal Tool Behavior. We updated it for the current book, but I'm going to give you the 1980 version and let you read the updated one for ourselves. So, here's the story. A zookeeper's working at a zoo and leaves a screwdriver in the great ape building where he was just cleaning and doesn't realize it, and leaves, locks things up, and walks away. Now, in the first case, let's say a gorilla comes into the enclosure. You just saw the photo of the gorilla Christina put up. The gorilla would wander around, do all of its normal things, never notice the screwdriver, and in the course of doing its normal activities, maybe step on the screwdriver accidentally and instantly shrink back in fear, gently approach it after getting its courage up, put its fingers out and touch the screwdriver, then eventually pick it up and sniff it and see if it's something to eat, and realizing it's not, drop it, walk away, and never pay attention to it again. Same scenario. The chimpanzee walks into the enclosure, notices the screwdriver instantly, runs over to it immediately, picks it up, chews on it, scrapes things with it, stabs things with it, tries to bend things with it, pry things with it, does everything that's possible to do with the screwdriver, and when realizes it has no other use, will throw it across the enclosure and never notice it again, never pay any other attention to it. The orangutan walks into the enclosure and instantly notices the tool, but doesn't reveal that it has, and avoids it for the entire day. And when he realizes that the keepers have gone home for the night, walks over, picks up the screwdriver, dismantles the cage, and leaves. So essentially I'm done, but now I'm going to verify it with some slides for you. So I mentioned the different types of great apes: gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos that you haven't seen a slide of yet, but I'll show you a slide. Those are the African great apes. The slide you see in front of you is an orangutan, the only Asian great ape. I like this slide just because it shows a wonderful example of the kind of tool use we equate with orangutans in captive settings, using a tool to open a lock, no trouble at all. Well, here's a slide our good colleague Ann Russin shared with us at a rehabilitation center in the wild. That happens to be a traditional lock where you have to put a stick in and move the bar by sliding it, and that unlocks the door from the inside. And you see the orangutan is preparing to do exactly what you saw in the previous slide, but just with a different type of tool. Same thing. By the way, this happens to be the kitchen for the camp where all the food is stored. So, starting with orangutans, this idea of orangutans using tools is not new. This print is from the late 1700s. Now, this was intending to represent an orangutan, even though the face doesn't look very correct. We assume that this was done from study skins. This artist had never seen a live orangutan. But you see that he easily attributes tool use to this orangutan, presuming that the orangutan, with its odd body dimensions, would need a walking stick if it was going to walk on its 2 feet. So, an easy misunderstanding if you've never seen an orangutan before. So, until very recently, and when we went back and reviewed all the literature, everything reported in the first edition of the book noted that orangutans are spectacular tool users in captive settings, but did almost nothing in the wild. What we saw were very, very simple things like you see here. Using some leaves to protect itself from the rain or to shade itself in strong sun, or things like using a branch like a fly swatter. Not too different from the elephant, by the way. So these were the kinds of tool use that we attributed to orangutans in the wild. Very simple, very common, but very, very, very little diversity. In 2003, less than 10 years ago, the floodgates opened in terms of understanding what orangutans are really doing in the wild. A research team started to look in new places and started to use some better observational techniques and started to discover forms of tool use never before known in orangutans. Here's an example. The fruit that you see is called the Nesia fruit, and the little seeds in there are like little fatty, rich treats for the orangutan, but they're protected by very irritating guard hairs. So the orangutans are using tools to move the seeds out of there while protecting their mouths, and typically for orangutans, they do fine manipulations with their lips rather than their hands. Here you see the very kind of typical example, as you saw earlier with chimpanzees, an analog to termite fishing. Here they're probing in arboreal insect nests, and it's unclear if it's just for the insects or for the insects and honey. It's probably a little bit of both, something not previously attributed to orangutans. Here's an example I love. You'll have to trust me a little bit because the photo's a little bit difficult to interpret. But this male orangutan's moving through a very thorny patch of trees, very difficult to climb in. If you look at the exposed hand, what the ape has done, it's stacked about 10 leaves, all one right on top of the other, in the palm of its hand to create the equivalent of a work glove. So it can move through the tree with the glove taking the brunt of the thorns. And the researchers noticed that when it became worn, they would replace it with a new stack. And also, they would move it to whatever hand or foot was bearing the most weight as they moved through the trees. Really terrific. This same idea is generalized by wild orangutans when they handle fruits like that Nesia fruit. And here one you see that's a durian fruit, very spiny and sharp. They make a pad that functions like a glove to protect their hands while they're using that. Well, that was a little bit of a relief for everyone because all we knew from captivity was that orangutans were spectacular tool users. So we were looking for something to help us understand this dichotomy. How can they be so fantastic when they're associated with humans in a captive setting, but not in the wild? So here were some examples we knew of now for several decades from captivity, the kind of prototype example of an orangutan stacking boxes to reach food. I love this picture, just mostly from the expression on his face as he's heading off to get the job done. And here, stacking up those 4 boxes and reaching that item that's extended overhead. Now, in rehabilitation centers where orangutans are captive orangutans being released back into the wild, we see kind of a remarkable array of different types of tool use. Here is an example. It's a little bit of a fuzzy picture because this was really a data slide. An orangutan had watched men creating lumber, and when they left, she picked up the saw and did the same thing. But in this case, just so you know, she put the saw through the majority of the wood before she moved on and went somewhere else, and did it perfectly by imitating the men that she had seen. Orangutans who don't swim, by the way, have learned to use boats. And they, of course, watched people using those boats to cross rivers or to go out along the bank, or they will sometimes use them to go out and collect aquatic vegetation for food and then come back to the bank. This has become a very typical behavior for them, where they will use boats in a variety of different ways very successfully and effectively. Here you see a young male borrowing a boat, and here you see a female with a baby doing the same thing with a dugout canoe. This has become a very typical and normal behavior for orangutans in these settings. Another favorite slide at one of these camps, this female had observed the men who do all the cooking in the camp, and what she did is she filled up that small container with kerosene, picked up an ember from a burning ember from the little fire remnants you see right there, dropped the burning ember in the kerosene, and then picked up the lid and fanned it to ignite everything. This was discouraged. But this was exactly what she had observed the men in the camp doing regularly. Now, we have this nice dichotomy with orangutans. We still have that to a degree with gorillas, as Christina was mentioning. Gorillas are very poor tool users in the wild. Here's one example that's quite nice, where we see a female using a walking stick to cross a body of water. She is using it to judge depth and to judge her footing and to stabilize herself when things got muddy. But we see very, very, very few examples in the wild, although one that's fairly common are so-called splash displays. Here's an adult male charging into a very shallow pool to create a giant splash when he comes in. It's thought this is for communication and display more than anything else. But we see very little except in captive settings. We see very typical examples of tool use. Here's a young female using a reaching tool. Just like gorillas, we have the same scenario now with bonobos. Here are some wild bonobos. We see almost nothing in terms of tool use from them in the wild. This is a branch display that you see, and bonobos are using the branches sometimes to augment a social display, or sometimes to try and get everybody moving when they want the whole group to move at the same time. But we see not much else in the wild when compared to orangutans and also chimpanzees that I'll talk about in just a minute. Here's a bonobo living in a sanctuary, and again, in a setting with lots of other social models, including humans, we see an explosion of tool use. Here, a bonobo using a stone hammer to crack open nuts. So here's the very classic example Christina and I think Ben, we all three have mentioned, chimpanzees termite fishing. Well, here's a single individual plucking those termites off the grass stem, and here's a group working together, or working simultaneously to extract termites out of this mound. So we see the highest diversity of forms of tool use in the wild in orangutans and chimpanzees. That's a significant finding only revealed in this book, prior to that, everyone assumed that there was a very, very low diversity with orangutans. We know now that in terms of types of tool use, chimpanzees and orangutans are rivaling each other. But there's a difference with chimpanzees, a big difference. Chimpanzees are using tools in more complex ways, such as simultaneous tool use. Things called, for example, a tool set, or associative tools. Here are chimpanzees using a hammer and an anvil simultaneously. So the bottom stone, of course, is the anvil. The chimpanzee has placed it. They'll place a nut on there and then use the hammer stone in her left hand to crack open the nut. While we're on that note, I don't have a photo of it, but one thing documented in chimpanzees that's quite extraordinary is this idea of meta tool use. The first example was a female chimpanzee engaged in this behavior, but her anvil stone was slanted. So it only had one flat edge, and the flat edge was down, so she'd put the nut on, and of course the nut would roll off before she could open it with the hammer. So she went and found a third stone, lifted up the anvil and used it as a wedge to create a level surface on the top, and then put the nut on the top and cracked away. So that meta tool made the anvil a more effective tool. We have a couple drawings in here because some of these things are hard to photograph. Chimpanzees will take water out of a tree hole, but here you see two tools being used. A group of leaves that have been chewed into a sponge that the chimp has put down into the water and is then extracting them with a stick. Actually, Ben and I saw an orangutan do this in a captive setting, and we were kind of dumbfounded. We were working with her, and she just did it spontaneously. We were kind of dumbfounded and wish we had a photo of it. A really complex form of tool use. Now, another interesting one, a little hard to interpret, but the photo on your left is a chimpanzee using a really stout stick to pound and open an arboreal insect nest to create the opening, and then using a thinner stick to extract the contents. So two tools used one after the other to solve the same task. Interestingly, though, even though we know this distinguishes chimpanzees in a significant way, and we know that they do these complex forms of tool use in the wild, using multiple tools to solve a task was documented in the early 1900s in a captive setting. So this is not a new thing for chimpanzees, but it is a new thing for us to be documenting it so regularly in the wild. Well, I'd like to end my section, then Ben will be back up to wrap up with two short slides. And I will tell you what I think is the most compelling thing, one of the most compelling things to come out of this new version of the book. We, the three of us, have gone through all the examples, and we defined a new mode of tool use that has never before been discussed. And we call it symbolic tool use. And in the cases of the photos I'll show you, this one and one after, it's the use of a tool to create some emotional or psychological comfort. And in this case, it's a female chimpanzee who died about a year ago, by the way, living in a zoo. And you see she's carrying that rubber alligator. Well, this rubber alligator was her security. No one knows how it started or why it started, but she carried this alligator for decades. And interestingly, it had to be that alligator. As it aged and got older, the keepers tried to trade her with a new rubber alligator, and she rejected every one. It had to be that specific one. And if she was separated from it, for example, she put it down and walked away, and she became very anxious until she went back and retrieved it. So this gave her great security and reduced any anxiety that she would have. And I'll end with one example, and this has been documented now, this exact behavior in orangutans in the wild, in chimpanzees in the wild, and in gorillas in captivity. And it's female great apes using some natural material, like a bundle of leaves, to create a doll. And using that doll, in this case, resting with it when she went into her nest at night, and her young offspring had started to become more dependent. The most dramatic example of this is a captive female gorilla who had an infant that she used to handle in very distinct ways, in a positive way, that died unexpectedly. And she then, after the infant died and was removed, created a doll from natural materials she had and then handled it in exactly the same way as she had handled her baby for a number of days after the death of her baby. I think it's a remarkable and compelling new aspect that we add to the literature and presents a whole host of questions about symbolic representation and how it moves forward into things like language, for example. Ben?
To keep things moving tonight, we really haven't acknowledged the hundreds and hundreds of scientists whose observations we're using without attribution. So I would at least like to acknowledge them, and they're all acknowledged in the book. So where do we go from here? Obviously, we're going to continue to record all reported cases of tool use and tool making for the 3rd edition of this book. And just yesterday, I learned about probably one of the most remarkable ever. And by the way, if you are an arachnophobe, you should look away, because the next slide that I'm going to show is of a spider. And this spider is absolutely remarkable. It's called a diving bell spider from Australia, and it lives underwater for 24 hours at a time and eats water fleas underwater. How does it do this? It's got a modified web in which it traps oxygen and carries the web around on its back and like a scuba tank while it hunts underwater and gets oxygen. It's just totally remarkable, and we keep coming across these things. So the 3rd edition is a big part of this. From my own point of view, and I think I speak for Rob and Christina, exploring all the cognitive bases of this tool use is extremely interesting. How do they learn this stuff? Do they learn from other conspecifics? Do orangutans learn from orangutans? They learn from people. We're learning that some groups of apes actually have tool cultures. So not all chimpanzees are the same. Some chimpanzee groups use tools in different ways, just like some of us use chopsticks and some of us use forks. And of course, we're going to be searching for the next generation scholar and his or her own ideas about where to take this. Does it go to robotics? Where is the future? So why should you care about all this? What difference does it make? We know that tool use and tool making shaped our species. It was a huge factor in making us the animals that we are. Many other animals, as we've seen tonight, make and use tools, but all of them, all that we've been able to document, their tools are powered only by their own metabolic energy and by gravity. This is a picture of a polar bear throwing a stone on a walrus to kill it. Humans began to power our tools with wind and water, and then with wood, and then with fossil fuels. When we made that switch to fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, electricity, we went from tools to technology. And we know today that the byproducts of technology are radically changing our environment in ways that many of us predict will alter life as we know it. So ironically, tools that made us the animals that we are, in becoming technology, may be our unmaking. The solution, of course, is to power our tools and technology with renewable energy. Thank you all very much.
How fascinating and how interesting. I want to thank Dr. Beck, Dr. Shoemaker, and Dr. Walkup for the wonderful presentation tonight. And now you all have in your booklets, you have a manila card at the bottom is a place that you can write down questions. Jan will be circulating through the audience to pick up any questions that she'll bring up. And we'll ask our distinguished authors here. I do want to mention one thing. Some of you may be worried about the garage closing at 8. It will not close at 8. I'm the director. I have to get out. I will get out tonight. So I will stay until the bitter end so you can be rest assured you can get out of the garage. One of the first questions that has been already asked, has there been a demonstrated sharing of tools, whereas one animal will be using a tool and will hand it over to another? Or is there an instance where there's a generational sharing of tool, and that would be something such as the crocodile or the alligator that would be handed off to another? Have you noticed any sort of instance of that?
I think the first part of your question, Greg, is about cooperative tool use. It is not common outside of humans, but did have a remarkable case. I was working at Brookfield Zoo, and I set up a situation where there was a family of baboons. One of the males, you saw his picture in there, knew how to use a tool to get food. And in the next cage, separated by a door that was too small for him to get through, but the rest of his siblings could get through, I put the tool. So he had to depend on another animal to bring him the tool or give him the tool so he could get food that they would all share. And within about 8 or 10 trials, one young female figured it out and brought him the food, brought him the tool, he would get the food, and she would get about 8% of it. Until she became sexually receptive. And then her share went up dramatically. I think there's also one case in the literature of a mother chimpanzee seeming to instruct her youngster in using tools, but that's much less common than we would think. There is observation learning, social learning at work, but it's usually an observer simply watching rather than intentional teaching. Fair?
Yeah, I think absolutely right. I can think of an example that's related to that, but a little bit of the reverse. I don't know any of you with sharp eyes might have noticed on the chimpanzee using the hammer and anvil. There were actually some numbers written on those stones because it's an outdoor laboratory, is the word our Japanese colleagues use. They will mark all the stones. They don't provide them, but they mark them with numbers so that they can see if these wild chimpanzees have preferences for specific stones. And they do. And your question about handing off, the answer is yes in a slightly different way. There is at least one very good example of a dominant male chimpanzee who had a very specific stone that he preferred as a hammer, and when he arrived on the scene, someone else was using it. And they know that because it had a number on it, knew exactly which stone it was. And he just went up, and I've seen video of this where he'll just go up and stand next to the one using, just stare at him very intently. And eventually the chimp using it, slows down a little bit and then just puts the stone down and walks away. And he'll pick up his favorite and go off to nut cracking, and then the subordinate has to find another one that'll do. So in that case, they have favorites, and they do pass them around in that way. But I think, Ben, you make a great point. This kind of teaching is very, very rare. It's much more observational learning than anything else.
We have a question from the audience. Can sounds ever be considered tools?
Well, we were thinking about, in order for it to be a tool, it has to be held. It has to be manipulated by the user. And so unless the sound is manipulated by the user, then it's not a tool. But there are examples with orangutans where they will hold a bunch of leaves to their lips, and they'll vocalize through those leaves, and that'll alter their sound. And so the leaves are the tool, and the sound is not the tool, but they are modifying the sound with the tool.
This question is something that I had written down that was an interest of mine, so two of us are on the same wavelength. Do great apes exhibit one-sided brain dominance, left or right?
Actually not completely clear yet. It's certainly true that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but that certain individuals may show a right-hand preference or a left-hand preference, and we tend to think about handedness as associated with the asymmetries in the brain, but it's not clear yet at the whole population level if this is true.
I mean, and there are some brain functions that are localized right side or left side, but I think that's different than the question. But yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah.
What degree of observation is needed to distinguish between a unique experience of a perceived tool use and the actual genetic proclivity to use tools? How do you distinguish between a unique incidence and this type of animal utilizing this whatever as a tool from time to time?
We think we don't. We don't distinguish. It's either tool use or it's not. So we haven't tried to segregate things as genetically based or learned or something like that. So I don't think at any point in the book we made that distinction or even tried to.
Ben, now this gets into the personal, your life, Ben especially, but all three. How did you first become interested in animal tool behavior, and what sparked your interest?
I'm going to give away my age here. It's now 1961, and I'm in a sociology class, and my professor comes in and says, "Humans are the tool-using animal." And I happened to be looking at an issue of National Geographic, and there was Jane Goodall publishing her first observations. Professor, so he wasn't happy at all to be questioned, so the next class he came in and he said, "Well, humans are the only tool-making animal." Well, in the meantime, Jane, in a subsequent issue of National Geographic, had specified that they're making tools. Well, I did not get a very good grade in that class, but it did set off a lifelong interest in animal tool use in me. And I have to thank the professor for setting up that situation for me.
Christina.
My background is in anthropology, and as Ben talked about, tools were critical in defining who we are as humans, and Rob actually introduced me to this topic as well, and brought me into researching for the tool book. So I think it's really a combination of trying to understand human behavior and also just being invited to work on the book that really led to my interest in this.
Well, it's a very similar answer for me, although Ben's the one that introduced me. When I was an undergraduate, I tried to do my best to work through the QL 737 portion shelf of the library, which had all the primate books. And animal tool behavior was actually in that section at the library I was working through. And so I've read it now several times, at least initially, and then having to write it again. So read it several times, and I think it was that. And then being around primarily apes and elephants and monkeys, and watching them devise new tools and use new tools, and it's a remarkably compelling field. I enjoyed immensely.
Is there a difference between male and female tool users? It's wonderful how they all, get together and they talk it out. And this is truly a collaborative effort.
Sorry, I feel like we're on Jeopardy or something.
Would you put that in the form of a question?
Yeah, it's kind of
please?
like the password is. No, we were just remembering there's an article, I don't think in general, but there is an article by Elizabeth Lonsdorf, who's at Lincoln Park Zoo, who studied chimpanzees in Gombe, and she found, let's see if I can remember it, Adult female chimpanzees and their daughters do termite fishing more often than adult males or adult female sons. So it's a gender bias in terms of the behavior. But I don't think it's a skill question. I think it's more of a question of females wanting to get those calories maybe from out of termites, and maybe it's more an ecological question, I think, not so much a skill question. But in that particular example, females do that tool-using behavior a lot more than males, at least at Gombe.
There's also the case with Jill Preetz's work. Jill Preetz from Iowa State, she discovered chimpanzees making tools that they use to stab bush babies, which are small primates. They actually stab them from their tree holes and then they consume them. But she actually found that it was the females that invented this behavior. And so it was first invented by a female and then spread to the offspring, and now it's spreading throughout the community. But it was first a female that invented it.
And now that you say it, it makes me remember there's a good orangutan example. We see males using big objects to augment a social display far more often than females do. Females might do it, but it's a very common behavior in adult males. And the most dramatic of this that you see in captivity, it might be throwing around whatever's convenient that makes a lot of noise, but buckets and barrels and so on. But in the wild, adult male orangutans actually, when they're starting to do a social display, will time it just perfectly and push down a dead tree. It can be huge and make a giant crash in the forest. And in the most extreme example, they grab on this at the end of their display and ride it as it's crashing to the floor. And at the very last second, grab on to a live tree and save themselves miraculously. But yeah, that's a clear gender bias in that one.
Toward the end of the presentation, Dr. Becky showed us how tools are changing our climate. Climate changes, how do they impact tool use from what you've seen so far? Is there any correlation?
I don't think there's any real data that we can see at this point, but it's a pretty good bet, and I'm not going to use this forum to lecture, but it's a pretty good bet that climate change, as we see it happening, is going to alter biodiversity. And a number of people are predicting that the orangutans that Rob so eloquently described are going to be extinct by 2025, in part because of habitat conversion and in part because of what we're doing to global climate. So this is a serious issue, I think, not so much for affecting tool use, but affecting tool users.
I have a question. How did you decide to put the bird photo on the cover of your book? Was it purposeful or a quixotic decision?
Okay, that's a really good question. I don't know, I won't ask you. The publishers were very concerned that 3 primatologists were writing this book. And we assured them that we were going to cover all animals absolutely equally without discrimination, but they were worried that, and we did. But they insisted on putting that picture of the bird on the front. We negotiated with them, but that's the publisher's call. And it really is a wonderful example of tool use. So those crows are really quite versatile and impressive in the way they're using and making tools.
Speaking about the fact that you're all primatologists, a question that was asked before this was, what is your favorite primate to work with? What is your favorite that you like working with, observing, etc.?
Okay, we're all going to answer on 3 because we're going to say the same thing.
1,
2, 3,
3.
orangutans.
Which is fairly disconcerting because when I was at the University of Minnesota, my undergrad degree was behavioral study. We worked with orangutans, and I always thought that they looked at me through the bars of the cage as if I should be in there, and they should be outside looking at me. So it's a very disconcerting animal to work with. And he's nodding his head. That's why you like them. We know humans have multiple learning styles. Is it possible that tool users have multiple learning styles, and could it be genetic? I think we've stumped them. To be continued in the future.
Oh, well, I guess we know that there's different types of learning how to use a tool. So some tool users seem to primarily rely on trial and error, kind of associative learning styles. Other primates can think through the problem mentally before they solve the task. And so they may be using a different learning style to solve the problem. And there certainly may be some type of genetic basis, though, guiding what they're capable of in terms of, you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, when you don't know the answer to the question, you try and debunk the question. So let me debunk the question. I'm not sure I buy that humans are learning how to use tools in very different styles. At least, I'm not talking about technology, I'm talking about tools. Because I'm thinking that tools are probably one of the very few things in human learning where you need to learn it in the kind of master-apprentice style that you can't really read in a book how to use, hand tools. You learn that by watching someone and by being guided in it, and then, of course, with some trial and error practice on your own. And I think that probably characterizes how most, at least great apes, are learning tools, their kind of tool use. I think kind of a master-apprentice style relationship. So that hammer and anvil stuff for the nuts and the termite fishing with chimpanzees, that takes years for them to get really, really good at. It's way more complicated than it looks. And that's true for people. It takes you a long time to figure it out. So I don't know. I would bet it's mostly observational learning as kind of master-apprentice for both humans and non-humans. But it's a good question.
And it certainly varies by species. So the fish that I showed you, there seems to be a genetic basis for that since there doesn't seem to be learning required. But with great apes, it's a totally different story.
Do you think tool use is less or more likely to be used in nature versus when the non-human is in captivity? Or vice versa? Is there any difference?
Yeah, I think we know that answer pretty definitively. For some species, with great apes, there's no question. When they're in association with humans, either in captivity or in sanctuaries or a rehab center or something like that, they use tools much, much more than they do in the wild. And I think it's simply because they have the opportunity primarily to learn it by watching humans in a variety of circumstances, probably more objects to use and more opportunities to do it. But we see the opposite, for example, with elephants. Elephants who have those same conditions use tools less in captivity. They use them more in the wild. So it depends on the species you're talking about. I think Christina's a good example of the genetically driven things like hermit crabs and archerfish and whatever. I don't think you really see a difference. I think they do it the same whatever the circumstances require. But you can answer that depending on the species. And at least for great apes, no question it's more when they're in association with humans.
Given the choice, is there a distinguishable preference for human artifacts and using that as a tool, or using natural tools versus using natural tools?
With apes, I think they'll use anything that's around, and if they're in captivity in a zoo or a sanctuary, they're probably more likely to find a broom handle than a nice stick. So I think whether it's a preference or not, most cases in captivity with apes involve some man-made structure, man-made object.
We have an audience member that wants to turn the table on you. You asked if it was a tool or not a tool. I've seen a video of a horse kicking and playing with a large ball. Is this a tool or is it just good fun?
Playing with a large ball, it depends. Was the horse trying to, for example, attract its owner to come? There's Virginia Croskery out there. Maybe she can answer the question. Because a lot of animals use objects to entice either members of their own species or members of other species to approach them. And in that case, we would say it is tool use. But frequently, horses, and we actually have a picture in the book of a zebra just playing with an object with no particular purpose. And therefore, like a bubble ring for a porpoise, we would not call that tool use, just object play.
And the last question I have, a human has to go to school 12 years or more to get an education. How many years equivalency would an animal like a primate have to go to school to become more intelligent? It's kind of talking about apples and oranges, but...
Yeah, I think it's. I think there's a couple ways to answer that. Well, to be technical about it, I think when you're in school for a certain amount of time, you learn all those things and you acquire knowledge, but your intelligence, your IQ, is remarkably robust whenever it's measured. So your IQ in first grade is usually the same as your IQ when you get out of college, whatever. So I'm not sure you're getting any more intelligent, but you're learning a lot of things. So we know that, for example, in orangutans, I can give you the exact number. With orangutans, young orangutans are entirely dependent or primarily dependent on their mothers, in some cases for up to about 9 years before they can live independently. And the mother is their primary source of knowledge. The secondary source is, of course, anything trial and error on their own experiences. So we know in that case we're talking about the better part of a decade for sure to be independent of the mother. But that's just essentially to get around in the forest and feed yourself. That has nothing to do with how you then interact with other adults, if it's a female, how you wind up raising your young. I don't think that 9 or 10 years really captures the learning phase. So I would say, gosh, we're into the mid-teens and early 20s easily, and you can certainly see great apes who are not very good mothers the first time they have a baby, maybe in the mid-teens, might be okay, not terrific, and they get better with each birth. So I think we see this as kind of a very long period of time. Very similar thing with elephants. And it really speaks into this whole idea of different cultures. The idea of elephants is a really good one because you can lose, what's the right word, kind of the memory of the group or a historical sense of, for example, you might have a matriarch elephant, and this is not necessarily about tool use, but about learning, and maybe only once in the last 30 years did they go through such a serious drought that they had to go to a specific place that was far off that only that matriarch remembers in order to find water. No one else in the group would know that. So in that case, there can be instances that over the course of decades that one or two older individuals in the group remember, and it becomes then useful for the entire group. So this is a very interesting question in terms of the lifespan of an individual or the shared knowledge that a group can use. So these older individuals are absolutely extraordinarily important in that regard. Elephants, gorillas, chimpanzees, not so much with orangutans because they're alone, same with bonobos. But it's a really interesting question. I'd hate to limit it to any period of time because I think there's a lot more complexity to it than that.
Well, it's now a little bit after 8:15. On behalf of the Des Moines Public Library and the Des Moines Public Library Foundation, I want to thank Dr. Benjamin Beck, Dr. Robert Shoemaker, and Dr. Christina Walka for their fascinating presentation tonight.